How should you configure your Ford SuperDuty? There are a lot of things to consider, like what box size do you go for, what configuration, how about the engine choice? There are axle ratios you have to look at, max payload versus towing. Based off of your specific need, there are a lot of things that you need to consider when you're building out your SuperDuty. Steve here, and in today's video, I'm going to be demystifying the SuperDuty. We're going to be covering off configuration options, engine choices, as well as max payload and towing specs for rear-wheel models, and also looking at the payload and towing guides on top of that. Now, if you're looking for something specifically on the F-150, I've put together a comprehensive video there. You can find it down in the description. And if you want to know what's going on with the 22 F-250s, or the SuperDuty in general, I have done a very comprehensive walkthrough, even on the technology, like the sync media screen and the steering wheel and cluster, that you can find down below as well. But before we get started, I do want to thank you so much for helping us support the channel. I just passed 10,000 subscribers, which is unbelievable, so I'm excited to see where the channel goes over the course of the next couple of years. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, and if you found this video useful, share it, because you never know who might find value in it as well. But let's dive into it, starting off with the different configurations that are available for the SuperDuty. Starting off, we've got our regular cab, which is going to be just the two full doors, so we don't have any back seats in the vehicle whatsoever. That thing's strictly available in the 8-foot box, and it's available as the 250, 350, or the 450. Now, one thing you will notice in this video is I don't really touch base on the stripped down chassis. Those are kind of a beast in and of themselves. So if you're looking for something specifically on the stripped down chassis, I recommend reaching out to a Ford dealer that specializes it. There are a lot of things you have to consider when you're looking at that type of build, if you're throwing boxes and things like that on yourself. But we've got our regular cab configuration, moving next into the super cab configuration. And the super cab is when we get the two full doors and the two half doors. So those back doors that swing the opposite way instead. Now, one thing that's different is that in the super cab configuration, we can't get the F450 whatsoever. Strictly going to be the F250 and the 350, but as you can see here, we can get either the 6 3/4 or the 8-foot box as an option. And on top of that, we also have the introduction of the Lariat trim level. Lariat trim level is when we get into our leather interior. So the base XL and the XLT are going to be a cloth interior, and the Lariat, I should say, will have a leather interior. Now, if you need even more space, we then move into the crew cab configuration, and that's the full 4-door. So we have two full doors in the front and for the second row. And that's when we get introduced to a lot of other trim levels that are available. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what's important for you out of a truck? Because realistically, if you're just looking for something to tow heavy stuff, you could look at just the XL or the XLT. But if you want a little bit more, like you want some nicer interiors, some nicer options, things like that, you've got a series of different choices that are available. With the crew cab configuration, we've got the King Ranch, which gives us the two-tone paint, the Platinum, and the Limited. But one thing to note, you can see here that the crew cab is also available in the 6 3/4 or the 8-foot box, so it's going to depend on what you need out of the truck. And it's going to be a mix of either single or dually, so that dual rear wheel. Always challenging to say that one. Dual rear wheel. There we go. I'm just going to call it dually in this video. So you can go either single or the dually, just depending on what your needs are. But the F250, strictly single wheel, the 350, either or, and then the 450 is strictly going to be that dually. So you have quite a few different options that are available. Like I said, we have a few different options looking at the trim levels, and even more options when we get into that crew cab configuration. So which way you go is going to depend on your budget and your own personal needs. Because another thing to consider is that as we look into different trim levels, that's going to take away from our max payload, which we'll touch base on a little bit later on in the video. But next up, we get into the available engine choices, and that's the same thing that we find in last year's model. We've got the 6.2-liter V8, and that's going to be the standard engine that you're going to find in the SuperDuty lineup. It's 385 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque. Now that 6.2-liter also is flex fuel capable, which means that we can use regular gas or also E85 if your local station has it available. From there, we move into the upgraded beefier 7.3-liter V8. It's 430 horsepower and 475 pound-feet of torque. So a good amount of power inside of this thing. And like I said, we've got the two options for gas. We've got the 6.2 or the 7.3 before moving into the diesel. So that's a 6.7-liter Power Stroke diesel V8, 475 horsepower with an impressive 1,050 pound-feet of torque. Like, absolutely amazing what this thing can accomplish. So if you're looking for something to be able to pull the most, you are looking at that 6.7 liter, but we're going to get to max towing in just a second. Because one thing I want to cover off is going to be the max payload. Well, I'm going to touch base on the Ford guide. So check down in the description below for a link off to that Ford payload guide, because the Ford guides versus what you actually get are going to be slightly different just depending on your configuration. So it's not as pronounced in the SuperDuty world, and not much of a difference in the SuperDuty in comparison to the F-150 series, because the SuperDuty payload max towing is way, way higher than what you're going to find in the 150. And that's something you have to ask yourself is, how much are you potentially going to be pulling, and what do you need your payload to be? Because if you're on the F-150 and you're kind of on that cusp of like the 150 versus the 250, and if you're nickel and diming the F-150 numbers, do yourself a favor, go for the F-250 or higher. So the last thing you want is to get a trailer that your truck can't support. Like, you invest all this money in this truck and all of a sudden you've got to order another one because you've ordered the wrong spec. And that's why watching videos like this is so important, to give you an idea or an understanding of what you need out of your truck. But all over the place, looking at payload, like we look at so single rear wheels. So we look at the regular cab which is going to have 4,160 pounds. But all of these numbers, like even looking at the F350, so the dually with the 4x2, it's going to max out at 7,850 pounds, assuming that you also do have the gas engine, so the 7.3 gas, which also has the gas heavy-duty payload package. So there are a few different asterisks and things like that you're going to find as you go through the Ford guides and even through this video. But in order to get those max specs, that's what you're looking at. So you're looking at the regular cab, dually 4x2 350 series. But here's the caveat to that. All of these numbers that you're looking at for the Ford payload guides, it's based off of nothing in the truck, with the exception of one single 150-pound driver. So me, I'm 6 feet tall and I weigh 175 pounds. So right from the get-go, payload is already reduced by an additional 25 pounds. So you have to take that into account. If you've got 4 full versions of me, that's 700 pounds that's potentially going to be taken off of the payload. So something to think about. It's kind of all over the place number-wise, but the payload itself, like I said, in the SuperDuty isn't as pronounced as it is in the F-150 when we start adding options in. But we're going to get to those max numbers and rear-wheel numbers in just a moment. But like I said, these things are all over the place. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how much payload do you need? How many people are going to be in the vehicle at any point in time? How much stuff are you going to have in the bed of the truck? What's the tongue weight of the trailer? Are you towing a conventional trailer? Do you need something with weight distributing properties? Or are you going to be doing a fifth wheel or gooseneck? So all of these kind of play into what you're going to be able to pull for max payload. So you have to ask yourself those right questions, and that's why it's important to find a Ford salesperson that can ask you the right questions, or that is asking the right questions, because you need to make sure you spec out your truck properly. As I said it before, the last thing you want is to order your SuperDuty and then find out it's not going to work with what you configure or what you need. So that's why asking the right questions and really understanding what you need out of a truck is so important. But max payload aside, we do have a lot of other things to consider inside of the truck. So we get into max payload, but this is where we get the true max payload numbers. So if you don't care about the configuration or other options, you just want to know what the max payload is, you can easily find that in the Ford guides. But I'm going to show you some examples of the highest available payload. Starting off with the regular cab, we need that 4x2 with the 8-foot box, 7.3 liter gas engine in the heavy duty payload package. So these next 3 examples all require that package, but we've got 7,850 pounds as our max payload with this configuration. So that is a pretty solid payload. Again, that's before we look at any other gear and things like that. Now, when we get up to the Super Cab configuration, that's going to be 7,190 pounds in comparison, so about 10% less than the regular cab, and that's just because of the added length of the box and the added weight of the vehicle because of that change from the regular cab to the Super Cab. So if you need the space though, you need the space, and that's where we get into the next one, which is the Crew Cab. So same idea, we have to go for that 4x2 8-foot box with the 7.3 liter V8, and that's going to give us 6,960 pounds as our highest available payload. But like I said, the payload is all over the place because we're, 3,000 and change pounds up to that 7,800 pounds inside of the other configuration. So which way you go is going to depend on what you need. And that's where things, like I said earlier, are going to really be based off of how you configure the rest of your truck. Because every option you add on, every little thing is going to affect your max payload capacity. So let's look at some real world scenarios. Like let's say if we've got a 250 crew cab, 4x4 with single rear wheel, that's the 6 3/4 box with a 6.7 diesel, and it's got a few different options available there. On paper, the max payload is 3,320 pounds, but if you look at that yellow payload sticker on the door, 2,870 pounds is the max payload in this truck based off of this configuration. So a little bit of a discrepancy based off of the on paper versus the real world because of all the extra stuff that's been added into this truck. Next example is going to be a regular cab, 4x2, single rear wheel with the 8-foot box. And that's got a few other options as well, but it's 4,500 pounds max on paper versus 4,399 on the yellow payload sticker. So not as big of a discrepancy there, and that's just because the XLT doesn't have as much stuff added in. So the more you add things in, you go 4x2 versus 4x4, that's going to subtract from your max payload. Next up is the 350 crew cab, 4x4 single rear wheel with the 8-foot box, 6.7 diesel, and this is the platinum, so almost the creme de creme. We've also got the option for the limited, but this is a fairly loaded vehicle. On paper, the max is 4,630 pounds, with the actual max in that payload sticker at 4,062 pounds. So a tiny little bit of a discrepancy, not a big one, but at the same time, there still is a tiny discrepancy you have to think about. From there, the last example is an F450 dually 4x4 with a few other actually quite a few options. Like even though this one is the XL base, it has a ton of other stuff in it. On paper, the max is 5,320 pounds versus the actual max, which is 4,869 pounds. So that's where we get into the idea that every little thing you add onto this vehicle is going to take away from your max payload capacity. And that's before we look at gear inside the truck and any additional passengers over and above people that are 150 pounds. So you have to think about that one as you build your truck out and you're speccing your truck is what payload do you need? Like I said, when we look at the SuperDuty versus the F-150, it's a very big difference. Because the F-150, if you were to have, let's say, the XLT versus the Platinum, huge difference in the payload, but not so much in the SuperDuty world because of the increased payload that we get inside of this vehicle. But there are a lot of things to consider as you're building this thing out. So then the next thing we're going to look at is going to be max towing, and these are going to be different scenarios for the 250, 350, and a number of other scenarios. So in our 250, all over the place, but this one here, we've got our conventional, so our weight carrying versus distribution versus our fifth wheel or gooseneck towing. And it breaks it down for 4x2 versus 4x4, and you can find all this stuff inside the Ford tow guides, but these numbers, again, are all over the place with a few asterisks because you require different technology and different options and things like that to get these payloads, or max towing, I should say. But conventional, so let's say if we've got 13,000 pounds on regular weight carrying, so our standard hitch receiver, versus a weight distribution hitch instead, which is going to help balance the load across the axles, you'll be able to pull a tiny bit more. And that's something you're going to want to look at. As you start carrying heavier trailers, you absolutely want to look at a weight distribution hitch, and we'll get into the importance of that one in just a little bit, but the numbers are all over the place. But typically when we get into the 4x2 regular cab, that's normally going to have a higher max payload and a max towing capacity in comparison to something like a 4x4 crew cab. So something to consider there. Now, when we look at the 350, we've got the option for either the single or dually for that rear wheel, and a series of options. Like I said, we've got the weight carrying versus distribution versus the gooseneck, so the fifth wheel gooseneck. Now, that's something you're also going to want to double check with the manufacturer of your RV or your trailer on, because you want to make sure that you've got the actual dimensions, but the weight of the trailer itself, so that you make sure that you're speccing your truck out properly. Like you've got a 10,000 pound RV trailer, that's cool, but if it's a toy trailer where you're throwing ATVs and things like that in there, typically the tongue weight's going to be a little bit higher. So that's something you have to figure out. Is your truck going to be able to support it? And that's where, especially if you're looking at the toy trailer where the tongue weight's going to be a little bit higher, you're going to want to look at probably the 350 or the 450 as an option instead. But again, it's going to depend on what you're towing. So it's something like I said, you want to make sure you're talking to your Ford rep about, and you're really diving deep into these numbers to make sure you're speccing it out properly, because you've also got the axle ratios to consider. But we take a look next up at our 450, and as we can see there, so we've got our either 4x2 or 4x4, and we can max out with this one at 24,200 pounds, which is absolutely mind-blowing. Like, it's crazy how much this thing can tow. But there's a caveat to that one, and that requires the weight distribution hitch setup. So that's the one where we're going to evenly make sure that we're distributing the weight across all of the axles. And it's kind of interesting. Like, I've seen people that tow trailers, I'm sure you've seen it on the road as well, where their front wheels look like they're higher up off the ground, and it looks like their butt end is kind of sitting a little bit low. Like, they've got this weird like V pattern going on, and it's just because they're not using a weight distribution hitch. But it's important to do that, and we'll touch on that in a second. Because firstly, I want to talk about different towing options, because the SuperDuty will have a tow package, well, at least the receiver regardless. And your base receiver inside of the SuperDuty is going to be a 2.5-inch receiver, and that's standard, as you can see there, on pretty much all of the F250s, with the exception of the HD tow pack, the F350, and then the F350 diesel. So our standard 2.5-inch receiver gets upgraded to a 3-inch receiver when we have that HD tow package and the 250 diesel. And then we've also got the 350 single reel, and as well as the dually and the 450 when we get that 3-inch receiver instead. And then we've got the option for the fifth wheel or gooseneck hitch prep package. Now, whether you go for this one or not is going to depend on what you're pulling. Because obviously if you're pulling a trailer that demands it, you need it. Like, could you do something aftermarket? Technically, yes, but it's just easier to get the plugs and everything done directly at time of ordering from the factory. But if for whatever reason the dealer that you've got doesn't have one on their lot, and you can only get what you've got there, you could do it aftermarket. There are different sliders that you can get if you're doing that. You've got different options for fifth wheel and gooseneck. But one thing to consider with this setup, so you want to make sure, firstly, if you're doing fifth wheel gooseneck, you're most likely going to need the 8-foot box instead, which means your truck is going to be insanely large. Like, if you ever take your vehicle to Costco, that's the difference with like an F-150 being able to kind of like easily pull into a spot versus having to kind of do like a 3 or a 4-way point turn in order to get into the parking space. Like, you look at the 450 crew cab 8-foot box, and that thing is a beast of a truck. But if you need it, you need it. But if you're pulling any sort of fifth wheel or gooseneck, as per Ford tow guides, you want to make sure that you've got the 8-foot box. And that's just to make sure that there's enough clearance between the front of the trailer and then the back of the cab. Because the last thing you want is if you have to do any sort of a jackknife turn, the last thing you want is for the trailer to damage the back of the actual cab. So it is recommended in Ford tow guide that if you're doing fifth wheel, you go for the 8-foot box instead. And that's going to be the frame bed cross as well as the 5 attachment plugs that are going to be right in the bed of the truck for easy installation for your sliders and things like that. But a lot of things to consider in your truck, and that's just looking at a few basics. Like, we haven't even gone all the way through this thing yet, because you've seen it in different parts of this video and in Ford tow guides. You want to look at weight distribution hitches. So weight distribution hitches are kind of an interesting thing, and they look typically something like this, where you've got a little part in the middle where it's either a manual hand crank or there's an electronic crank, and what that's going to do is balance out the load between the truck and the trailer axles. So a big benefit there is that we've got an even load distribution as we go. Because I want to show you this picture. This is kind of ridiculous. So we take a look here, and I'm sure you've seen that kind of like V pattern I was mentioning earlier, where you've got the rear axle of the truck kind of down like significantly lower than the front end, and then same idea with the trailer. So you want to make sure that you're balancing things out a little bit more. So with a weight distribution hitch, you'd essentially take your base measurement there. There's that little piece kind of right in the middle of the distribution hitch that you would then remove. It would give you that V shape, but then you either manually crank or you've got your power crank in order to distribute the weight evenly between the axles of the truck and trailer. So this is where you want to go if you're pulling heavy loads. So definitely want to make sure you're getting that weight distribution hitch set up instead. But there are so many things to cover off, and I've really just scratched the surface, and I hope you've learned a couple things. Like I said, we've got a series of different options for the configurations, our engines, and then even looking at the different trim level choices. But I've said it earlier, and this is why it's so important to find a sales rep that you really jive well with, that you get along with, that's asking the right questions, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you're investing into the right truck for your personal needs. And rewatch this video as necessary, because there's a lot of information that's covered off. You might find some nuggets if you rewatch as well. I know I speak a little bit fast sometimes, so if you found I talked a little bit too fast, just go back and then try it at 0.75 times. So slow the speed down 8 times tiny little bit, but I've utilized chapters and a number of other things to make it a little bit easier for you to jump kind of back and forward. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you are looking for a walkthrough on the Ford SuperDuty, so the actual truck, check down below for that video. If you want this video, so this type of walkthrough on the F-150 series, check down below for that one instead. And I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any questions, though, drop down in the comment section below. I'm more than willing to talk you through any issues that you might be having. We can bounce some ideas off of each other, or I can set you up with another dealer that might be able to help you out. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your social networks, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep on going on this crazy YouTube journey together. And until I see you next time, though, take care.